Okay guys, tonight's story is insane. It's a Reddit horror story called Don't Fear the Reaper by Reddit user That Boy Next Door 93. And it's absolutely terrifying. Like seriously, this one is next level. It messes with the whole Reaper concept in a way you won't believe. You have to hear this. I've linked their Reddit profile below so you can find more of their awesome stories. And, as some of you might have guessed, this story draws inspiration from the 70s classic, Don't Fear the Reaper, a song by Blue Öyster Cult. Now then, here's how it all begins. I was 12 the first time I saw a dead body. It was stiff, cold, and lifeless. It didn't matter how much makeup the mortician put on her. I touched her hand and felt nothing. No sadness, no fear of my own expected fate, no hatred, just a vast nothingness. Looking back, it makes sense that I would cut myself off from my emotions, but at the time, it felt vile. I was looking down at my mother's corpse, and I felt nothing. And then I saw him. That was the first time I had felt anything since my mother's passing. I stared at him, cloaked in shadow. His face was obscured, but his eyes were like black holes, vast and empty, yet burning with a force strong enough to consume everything they gazed upon. I felt my skin burn as his eyes moved over me. I flinched and turned away as mine met his. And then he was gone. I wasn't sure if I had imagined him in a fit of grief, but his burn felt too real. Maybe I had just gone mad. I told no one what I saw, what I felt, especially not my father. He had enough to deal with. 17 years would pass before I saw the man with the burning eyes again. How I would come to rest my gaze upon him once more, however, left much to be desired. If I could live my life over, erase all the pain that came in search of him, I wouldn't change a thing. The truth is, I love him. I love death. Teenage adolescence and hormones hit me like a train in high school. My obsession with those black eyes took over the mask of sanity I once hid behind. I had fully embraced the dark. I mostly kept to myself and, in doing so, subconsciously distanced myself from my father. I was a bitch, admittedly. At the time, I thought I was doing him a favor, giving him space to heal. In truth, I was selfish. He needed me, and I needed something else. I spent most nights studying at the local cemetery, trying to learn more about death. After high school, I earned my bachelor's degree in mortuary science. I studied everything I could associate with it: psychology, biology. I even took multiple art classes focusing on human anatomy, color theory in relation to psychology, and a prosthetics and SFX course with the theater department. After I graduated, I went back home and began my apprenticeship at the same mortuary that had taken care of my mother. The old man who ran it was, well, old. He taught me everything he knew before his death, but most importantly, he taught me how to speak. I learned how to conduct myself, both when planning services and while hosting them. I learned how to be exactly what someone needed me to be in the moment, whether I was the hero who brought life back to the deceased, or the villain who put the final nail in the coffin. But that's exactly what death is, the pure embodiment of the grey area we all try to pretend doesn't exist. I never understood that. Why should anyone be so afraid of the grey? The grey is what gives us purpose. The grey is what drives us through life. I am the grey. I live on the precipice of death every day. That breath of life still enters my lungs. And yet, I want nothing more than to feel it stop, to see those black eyes once more, And finally, after years of morbid longing, I saw them. It was the day of the old man's funeral. He had no family, and given his profession and his obsessions, he had no friends either. I could relate to that. He saw that same shade of grey in me, and we bonded. I did not shed a tear upon finding him on the mortuary floor. Beneath the cold metal slab he would soon occupy himself. I shed no tears as I opened his chest cavity and determined his cause of death, a faulty heart he had hidden from me. I shed one single tear as I dressed him in his favorite suit, knowing I would never lay eyes on it again, and I was like stone throughout his funeral service. The only people who showed were those who had lost, people he had comforted in their grief. It almost brought another tear to the corner of my eye, but it stopped the moment I saw him. Standing in the doorway was a tall man. I felt my body begin to burn under his gaze, and I rose from my seat suddenly. Everyone looked at me in confusion and annoyance. The shadow drifted out the door, and I followed, just as I had once before as that helpless 12-year-old girl. But the moment I stepped outside, he was gone, vanished into the vast nothingness. My heart raced, then sank into the deepest pit of my core. I knew then what I felt for him. It was more than an obsession, more than a great longing for the unknown. It was love, the love a mother feels when growing a soul in her womb, the love an old woman feels when her sweetheart lies in a coffin. It was pure. I was in love with him. I waited at the doorway for him at every service I provided after that. The old man had left me the business, but it seemed he had not left me his decorum. I did not attend to the loved ones as I should have. I was aloof. I was waiting to see him again, but he never showed. The services became fewer and farther between. The people in town began to resent my apparent lack of respect. They wanted someone who could conduct themselves properly, be the hero and the villain as needed. But I was no longer both. I was only the villain. I hadn't hosted a service in nearly a month before a new body arrived on my slab. Male, mid-60s, Caucasian, brown hair, cause of death, failed liver. Name, John Mabry. Funny, I always just called him Dad. I was statuesque, as I had been for years, when suddenly I felt a tear slip down my cheek and collapse onto his chest. And then I fell. My knees crashed onto the tiled floor beneath me as I clung to the metal table with the fiercest grip and screamed. I screamed for my daddy to come and help me like he always had, but he didn't come to me this time. He wanted to, but he couldn't. It was time for me to take care of him. I wiped my face, cleaned the blood from my knees, changed my gloves, and began the embalming process. At the funeral, I saw family I hadn't seen since my mother's passing. Aunts, uncles, cousins I had never met, grandparents, shockingly still alive. They all had something to say about my profession, slipping in their opinions between routine sympathies. It was odd being the one consoled rather than the one consoling. I wasn't the hero. I wasn't the villain. I was the victim, and I hated it. I slipped outside for a moment of air, that bittersweet breath of life. A chill ran down my spine, like a gentle finger tracing my skin in an act of compassion. I shook it away and turned back toward the service. That's when I saw him. He was standing over my father's casket. He was smiling at me. He stepped out from behind the casket and began gliding toward me. As he moved closer, the details of his face began to materialize, like a corpse being set. His features were delicate yet sharp, his skin pale as ice, his eyes still black holes. Thin black fabrics took the shape of a suit, draping over his frail frame like silk. He looked like he could pierce right through me. And he did. I turned and screamed at him to stop. The whole room went silent. Everyone turned to me. Aunts rushed forward asking if I was all right. But I shoved past them. I had to follow him. I had to follow death. But once again, he was gone. The service wrapped quickly after that. One aunt, my mother's kid sister, gave me a tight hug on her way out. As she held me, she whispered in my ear, "I'm always here for whatever you need. No questions asked." She pulled away and gave me the softest smile. "Look after yourself," she asked gently. I gave her a hollow promise that I would. Her smile faded. A slight shiver ran through her body as she turned away to leave. That night I stayed in the morgue. I lay on the same metal slab that had held my father, my mentor before him, my mother before that. I closed my eyes and let them fade into small black holes as I felt my soul begin to wander. My lungs slowed. The pulse in my veins softened. My body grew heavy. My mind began to spark. It was like violent lightning in the midst of a fireworks storm. I began to cry. I opened my eyes with a sudden realization. The lightning in my mind had migrated to the window. A crash of thunder. The dance of tears against the roof. I pushed through the wind outside and let the sudden storm wrap around my body. Guiding my soul, I got into the dry interior of my car and turned the engine, foregoing the safety belt. I wandered aimlessly out of the parking lot, down the narrow back roads toward town, letting the tires decide where I would go. They led me to an old bridge. Rainwater had pooled. The tires lost traction. I gave way to the wheel as it spun violently against the side rail, then through it. My head collided with the roof as the car flipped. Shattered windows took turns biting at my skin. Eventually, the spinning stopped. The glass settled, and all that remained was the sound of the rain against the underbelly of my car. I felt a warmth in my eyes as my body grew cold. My skin felt thin, my lungs tight. Then I heard a voice. "No." I turned to my right. He was there, sitting upside down in the passenger seat, staring at me with a stern expression. "No," he repeated. "No?" I spat back at him. "What does that mean? Just let me go, please." He simply said, "No," once more, and then he disappeared. I closed my eyes. When I opened them again, I was surrounded by textured beige walls, wrapped in an itchy wool blanket. My body was sore, but it was there. It was ticking. He was not, and I began to cry. A nurse told me that one of my relatives had seen my wrecked car. They had apparently left something at the funeral home and found me on their way back. For a fleeting moment, I hated them. I hated them so much that my blood began to steam. But what else should I have expected? I appreciated their heroism, but in truth, all they did was prolong my desire. That night, as I slept, the fireworks returned. I was jolted awake by the sound of alarms. Nurses ran past my door, and then he appeared. He stood in the doorway, watching the chaos unfold. He turned his head, his black hole eyes settling upon me. Then, with a small nod of acknowledgement, he turned away and walked toward the mayhem. After the accident, my obsession had infected my body and became like a putrid disease that seeped through my pores. One night, as I was walking home from the bookstore, a whirl of police lights flew past me, and I felt my stomach flip. I followed in their direction and came across an old home surrounded by police. I walked as close to the line as I could and watched as two men dragged behind them a white sheet-draped stretcher. A sharp man to my left whispered too closely to my ear, "Looks like you have a new customer." I didn't acknowledge him. In fact, I hardly registered what he had said until well after the fact. I was too focused on him. I snuck around back and climbed into the deceased's home through an open window. There he was, standing at the front door, watching the body get carted away. He did not turn to face me, but he acknowledged my presence as he spoke.
"Why are you here?"
I merely responded with a question of my own. "Why can I see you?"
"Because you want to see me. Most turn their ugly faces in the presence of their own mortality. You stand tall in it. You're ignorant."
He spoke those last words with such parental disapproval that I felt my stomach sink and the scorching fever of embarrassment flood my cheeks. I ask again, "Why are you here?" He turned to face me now. His face and frame were all the same, but his eyes had softened into a whimsical curiosity, devoid of the darkness that once inhabited their sockets. He was beginning to appear more human. "Why do you look like that?"
"I take the form of what the onlooker finds most appealing."
As I opened my mouth to speak, he spoke in my place.
"You want to know what I truly look like?"
I nodded softly.
"Ah, but you do not. I do not alter my appearance under my own autonomy. I mold under yours. If you truly wanted to know what I look like, that is how I would appear to you."
Suddenly he began to change. His trousers turned to fur, his loafers into hoofs. His face became more angular as his nose flattened into it, and his eyes became black holes once more. His fingers grew, and the thin black fabric fell from his chest. His ears spread like wings, and spiral horns began to form out of his frontal lobe. He was magnificently beautiful. I reached out a hand and ran my fingertips over the soft fur of his nose.
"It is not your time."
He spoke this without moving his mouth. "Is that truthfully for you to decide?" He spoke nothing in return, only turned away and walked out the door. I did not follow this time. I just remained in the silence left that held me. I savored it. After that night, I began listening to the hums of the police frequencies and stalking the local news channels. I waited in earnest for a potential death, and the moment one transpired, I would just as quickly find myself at the scene. I did not bother to speak to him, though. I merely observed now, as I once had in college lectures. I made notes in my subconscious on how he approached the dead, and soon began to see the dead themselves. They never noticed me. However, they were as fixated on him as I had been. He had been so gentle with them all, and on one occasion, I wondered to myself how he appeared to them. At that instant, he began to change once more. His body vanished under a long and flowing black fabric, so black it seemed as though there was a tear in the universe itself. His horns flattened into the fabric and draped over his now hollow face like a hood, and his face became pale and skeletal. Was this what this man found the most appealing? The most common depiction of death? A hooded skeletal entity, ready to rip your soul from your body with his scythe and steal you away? The next few passings, he appeared to me in his true form, but would change once again into his cliché presentation once the fresh soul laid eyes upon him. Before I had time to process all the new bodies that laid upon my slab, it was early winter and a boy was missing. A search party had gathered through town to find him. His home had been broken into, and the police had found copious amounts of blood that did not match his. Amid the chaos, his mother died in a frenzy of spectators and journalists. She lay now in front of me, never receiving the closure of what happened to her son. I began to cry. I hadn't cried since my father's passing, but something about this woman called to me.
Why do you weep for her?
I don't know.
Yes, you do. Why do you weep for her?
I knelt on the cold, stained tiles of the morgue, flipping through the filing cabinet my mind has become, looking for any note I may have taken that could provide an answer to his question. I responded only with more tears, my jaw unhinging for words to come out that never came. A sense of clarity dangled on the sound that just merely eluded my pleads for explanation.
I understand your pain.
A pause hung with the putrid stench of flesh and chemicals in the air, like old friends.
And your love for it. You mourn the woman's never-ending uncertainty, just as you mourn your quiet certainty. You both desire to give her the answers and wish you could trade her place. Tell me.
His voice caressed the skin of my neck as he spoke.
Do you truly crave me that fervidly?
What happened to him? Her son.
Do you care?
I care on her behalf as she no longer is able.
He was taken by something unnatural.
Unnatural? I asked.
Something inhuman, an entity, a monster.
Is he alive?
No.
Is she with him now?
Are you asking if they are in heaven or hell, or if there is any merit to the stories of the two?
I remained silent. All of it, I wanted to say. Tell me everything.
It's more complicated than all of that.
He stared at me with his hollow eyes once more, filled with a sense of wonder.
Would you like to see?
He held out his hand, and I placed mine in his palm. Together we fell into a fabric of darkness, deeper and deeper into the void of perpetual existence. As the fabric of reality bled away, a room began to form around us. It was a child's room. A chill rolled in from the busted window across from us. I heard a voice down the hall, and another, more sinister sound responded. I followed in a trance and saw him, the missing boy, holding the hand of a monstrous figure as it guided him through a door. I followed behind into a darkened place. I saw nothing, felt nothing, heard nothing, until a slight cry rang from behind me and slowly grew into a guttural wailing. I turned around and was back in the boy's room, now covered in blood, with his mother weeping at the side of his bed. I don't want to see this anymore. I turned away as I became lost in a crowd of people surrounding the corpse that now laid out on the street, in a pool of blood that rushed from her head. And there he was, staring down at her. He was small, maybe 3 feet, with shaggy blonde hair and glasses. The mom rose from the ground and hugged her boy desperately. I'll never leave you alone again. I love you so much. She stroked his hair as she spoke through sobs on his shoulder. Are you ready to go home now? He asked her, and she simply nodded, taking his hand as they walked together into their eternity. You gave her peace. You gave her back her son.
I merely took the form of which she would find most appealing.
And the boy?
I'm afraid he is in a place I cannot reach, the darkness I followed him into. It exists in a plane I have no access to.
Will he ever escape?
Perhaps, though the young rarely do. Eventually their souls die, and their energy disperses and becomes something new. Through destruction there will always be space for creation.
What are you exactly?
I am.
I closed my eyes, and I was back in the morgue. I wiped the last of my tears from my cheeks and began to clean the woman laid out in front of me. Only a few people came to the woman's funeral. Her parents, a woman who seemed to be her co-worker, and a drunk straggler who began shouting at her casket. He was raving mad, blaming her for his son's disappearance, before her own father ripped him away and out the door. I thought, I wish I could tell him it wasn't her fault, that his son was taken by something unnatural. Of course he wouldn't believe me, even in his inebriated state that bound him to my table. The grandfather came back in from the cold without him. I heard him whisper to the others that he had sent him home. That man was not stable enough to refrain from shouting at a wooden box, let alone drive. I snuck out through the side door and saw him starting up his car. I tried to shout to him, but he didn't hear me over the frozen wind and the bouncing engine. I hit the ground running as he began to pull away. The icy air bit at my cheeks, leaving them burned, and my heels sank into the winter mud beneath me. The car was already swaying as he attempted to find the exit. In the distance, standing at the base of the bridge that connected me to town, he appeared, a spectator in my mad attempt to stop this man from hurting himself. My heel dug into the mud as my body fell out of it and onto the pavement. As I began to pull myself up, I locked wide eyes with him above the fender, now barreling toward me. The car swerved away, sliding across the icy, wet lot. The sound of his brakes beckoned everyone out to watch as the tires picked up speed. The car only began to slow as one side started to lift from the ground and dropped back down to a halt. The man sat, white knuckles gripped to the wheel, his wide eyes reflecting the whole scene. He did not move. The woman's father rushed over to him and opened the door. The man still did not move, and we heard a command for us to call 911. He had died as the car spun out. His severe level of inebriation caused his body to go into complete shock as the heart attack kicked in. His heart had been slowly giving way beneath him and had finally held all it could. All of this I knew before the ambulance had arrived.
Are you pleased?
Yes, now he will know the truth. The air fell silent.
Will he?
Won't he? I shouted back in confusion. When I faced him, he had once again taken the form of the boy. He turned away and walked over to the father, took his hand, and let him cry onto his shoulder before disappearing. His question haunted me. Are you pleased? I thought of it all night. Was I pleased? There was a constant echoing hollow that lived inside of me. Every day, every second I breathed air into it. The only time it felt somewhat full was when a body lay in front of me. I always spent my time with them. Typically, there were permissions I would have to thoroughly follow that the deceased or the family would have laid out for me. I would remove their clothing and cradle their head like a fragile infant. They appeared like statues to me, statues with stories, little details in their skin, their bones, their hair, stories the architect gave them as he sculpted them with intention. Next was the embalming, which I almost always remained by their side for. I would spend hours with them, reading to them, studying them, tracking the inventory of their belongings, keeping them company in the cold. Once the embalming was finished, I'd set their features and begin to bathe and shave as needed. I would massage them as the germicidal soap water ran over them, attempting to relieve any rigor mortis in the body. Once they were clean and dry and the muscles were relaxed, I would begin what I called the fixing process. It was always my favorite part of being a mortician. It's what drew me to the profession to begin with. As I used my hours of studying the person to slowly breathe new life back into them, it was as if I were meeting them for the first time, the real them. It was what brought peace to the families as they said goodbye to them, and I said hello. Sometimes I felt jealous of the body in front of me, wishing I was the one being bathed, looked after, being put to rest. That was how he made me feel. His eyes were as hollow as my insides, and in them I felt full and seen. I felt not alone. The craving of that understanding. I wanted to be with him always. The only time I did not feel that rise of burning envy for a body was when she was on my table. Only pity. That's why I cried. Her death felt unwarranted. I was not jealous of her. I wanted to trade places with her for her sake, not mine. But then I saw the unrest fall from her face as she looked at her child, and I understood then why. And I once again wanted to share in the experience. Once all had gone, the flashing of the ambulance, the distress of the family, leaving only the body in the casket, I began to clean. I cleaned the morgue, cleaned the funeral home, and cleaned the mud from my clothes. Everything felt dirty. Everything felt misplaced. I felt misplaced. I hadn't felt this since I was a girl, when my mother passed. The day of her funeral, I did the same thing. I did the dishes and vacuumed. I made my bed and put all my clothes away. I just remember feeling like I needed to correct something, like something wasn't in its place. I felt this same sense of comfort in cleaning the dead, fixing them. Yet I still felt as though I wasn't done. Things weren't fully clean yet. There was mud still on my arms, my hands, my legs. I was filthy. I ran a bath for myself and warmed the room with candlelight. I massaged my arms, my chest, and my legs as I cleaned the dirt from my skin, exposing the pale statue underneath. I let myself soak in the warmth of the water for a while, letting my muscles unravel and relax. Before the bath went cold, I pulled myself from the water to dry. I dried my hair and styled it into a messy bun that barely held together. I dressed myself in a pale night slip, covering it with a plush bathrobe. I sat at the vanity and examined the stories I carved into my skin, studying them. I read up on the distress lines across my forehead from the constant scowling of my teenage self, the lines around my eyes and brow from always squinting while I read or worked on the bodies. I looked at the scars on my arms and back, then up at the woman staring back at me. She smiled as her eyes met mine. It looked unnatural on her face, as though she were not used to that particular muscular flex. Our hands rose as we placed them together, a final goodbye, before slamming my fist through the mirror. I held tight to a fallen fragment of my reflection before disappearing with the world as it turned to eternal black. I awoke to a chill from an open window. The wind appeared like a final breath, extinguishing the candlelit room I laid on the floor of. The curtains flew, revealing the tall horned shadow in the window. I rose from the damp floorboards beneath me, once a light brown, now stained a deep cherry color. My arms felt weak as I held them like anchors. He came over and took my hands in his, speaking softly.
Don't be afraid.
I traced the outline of spilled blood over my arms and exhaled in relief. I no longer felt misplaced.
Is this what you desire? Do you wish to exist as I, eternally dredging the line between destruction and creation?
I do. I embraced him tightly and watched as the door opened into the hollow. I whispered goodbye to myself as he guided me through.
It is not goodbye. You called to me. You received me. Now it is your turn to be what they want you to be. Will you be their hero or their villain?
I gazed up at his eyes and said simply, neither. I will just be.
Good.
So what did you think of Don't Fear the Reaper? Did it give you the creeps? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon, because I share stories twice a week. Thanks for watching. By the way, did you catch a glimpse of my less skeletal self in the intro? Oh boy, wasn't I handsome. Pity I died so young. Maybe one night I'll tell you how. All right then, once again, a big thanks to the writer for sharing this beautiful yet scary story. This is your very own Mr. Hauntingly Yours signing off. Until next time, be careful when the night falls. You never know who or what might be listening.